If you have your Bible, you can be turning over to Matthew chapter 26 as we continue our study of the what we would call the ultimate question that's being asked. Over the last few weeks, we've looked at different people that have been in Jesus' life and how they have responded to him. Now, as Jesus is hanging on that tree, he looks out, he sees the soldiers, as we've looked at, who have dismissed him. And they've rolled dice for his clothes. They're really not taking in account who Jesus really is. He sees these Romans who have tortured him. And he sees his own people, as we looked at last week, who have rejected him as they shouted, "Crucify him." But perhaps the response that was probably most troubling to Jesus is those who were closest to him. I mean, those closest followers, with the exception of John, the rest of his disciples, those people who have been following Jesus, they've abandoned him. Now, for the last several years, they haven't left Jesus' side. They've been right there with him for 3 years. They have done everything that Jesus has done for the most part. They have been right there with him. They followed him. But now in his greatest hour of need, they are nowhere to be seen. They're nowhere to be found. When things got really difficult, Jesus' disciples abandoned him. They've deserted him. Now, have you ever been deserted in your greatest hour of need? That time when you really needed someone the most, you said, any time I ever in a problem or run into a situation in my life, I know I could count on, and you fill in the blank. This person's going to be there for me. I'm sure that maybe someone comes to your mind. There was a story that I read some years ago about this young Desert Storm soldier who had received a Dear John letter from his girlfriend while he was overseas serving in the Desert Storm over in Iraq war. He gets this letter from his girlfriend. It simply says this, that she's met someone else and that they've decided to get married. You can imagine how he felt. But to add insult to injury, she then says this in her letter, "Will you please return my favorite photograph of myself? I need it for my engagement paper in the local newspaper." Well, his buddies who are in his company, they get together, they come up with a plan on how to help their fellow soldier out. And so they decide that they're going to take a picture of their girlfriend, and they collect as many as they could, extra pictures if they had them, and they give this picture to their buddy, and they place it in a shoebox. They always have a shoebox full, and then he mails this whole shoebox full of pictures to this girl, and he says this with a little letter, "Would you please sort out and find which one is yours, because for the life of me I can't remember, and please send me the rest of them back." Now, that's a good way of handling things, I think, at times. But, I mean, you think about being deserted and rejected. This guy probably felt like he knew what that would be like. I don't think anybody likes to see anyone betrayed or hurt, especially when rejection comes from someone who you feel very close to. I mean, it was one thing for the crowds and the soldiers to dismiss Jesus and to walk away from him and completely just reject him for who he is, but I mean, where's his disciples? Those people who spent 3 years of their life, they've ate with Jesus, they've slept in the house with him. No matter where they are, Jesus has been right there for them. And now they're nowhere to be found. And I think their response to Jesus changed when life got hard. I mean, the challenges of life will often reveal our true response to Jesus and who we really think he is in our life. So this week we're going to consider this ultimate question that we've talked about just a little bit better. We're going to look at it from a different perspective, and that is that when life gets hard, what do you do with Jesus? You remember we've been asking the question all along. We just ask it a little differently. You know, when we talk about deserting the disciples deserting Jesus, we typically think about and focus on maybe the person of Judas. And we think about how he betrayed Jesus, or maybe we would even go as far as thinking about Peter and how he denied Jesus and what that response was in light of the things that were going on. But I think the other disciples' response was just as indicting as Judas or Peter's. Their desertion seemed surprising. I mean, you think about it. They had seen all these miraculous things take place. I mean, they'd watched as Jesus made the lame walk. They had seen Him help blind people to see again. They'd even been there when Jesus turned a funeral procession into a family reunion. I mean, they've seen it all. And so why would friends leave such a man after all of this? That's the question we have to ask. And I think it seems incredible until we examine our own hearts and the histories that we have, and we realize that we're really not much different now than they were then. Because it's only when we feel like that things are really going great in our life that we're all about Jesus. I mean, we can celebrate all the good things, but you let persecution come, you let someone say, "You're a follower of Jesus?" And we, in so many terms, will all but say, "I don't know the man." And so what I want to do this morning in the next few minutes is just maybe consider a few of the disciples' stories and why they deserted Jesus at His most vulnerable time in His life. And I just want to give you 3 different examples of stories throughout this little message, and I just want you to kind of fill in the blank of these people and maybe just give you a word or two that reveals maybe what they made a decision to desert Jesus during this desperate time. Number 1, I think we have to just think about the disciples' story as a whole. I mean, if you have a Bible, if you're looking in Matthew chapter 26, we read a little bit about what's going on in a number of the verses there, in Matthew chapter 26 and 27. And so if we were to look in verse 36 of Matthew 26, we read this. It says, Then Jesus went with His disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And He said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with Him, and He began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then He said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell on His face to the ground and He prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as You will." Then He returns to His disciples right after this, and he finds them sleeping. Now, could you imagine being with Jesus and He asked you to do something and He comes back and finds that you're not doing what He's asked you to do? And so Jesus simply says this. He says, could you men not just keep watch with me for an hour? I mean, couldn't you just help me out a little bit? Do what I asked you to do. And He told Peter this, and He says, "Watch and pray that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak," the Bible would say. Now, if you read Scripture, you find out this happens 2 more times. I mean, he had asked His closest friends and companions to be in prayer for Him and to pray with Him. And after this big meal, you remember they've been up in the upper room. They've had this little celebratory Passover feast that they've been acknowledging. This is when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. They've had this big meal. It's been a stressful, long day, and these guys probably, because of in the cool of the afternoon, in the evening, as they're lying there around these trees and a nice breeze is blowing there in the Garden of Gethsemane, they begin to kind of zone out a little bit. And they, for whatever reason, as Jesus asked them to pray, they're just too tired and they just couldn't do it. Now, I think the phrase that you could write down to remember when you think about the disciples' story could simply be this: fatigue and fear. I mean, that's why they deserted Jesus. It was because of the fatigue and fear that they had been dealing with. When Jesus requests their prayers, they want to comply. They want to do what's right, but they're just too tired to do it. Have you ever felt so tired that it's just hard to stay awake and focus and do the things you need to? I mean, maybe you felt like this during an interview or something at work, or maybe it was during a movie as you're out on a date. You've had worked a long, hard day, and you decide that you want to get together with your girlfriend or your spouse or whatever the case may be, and you go to the movies, and as you're sitting there, and it's supposed to be a nice romantic evening, you look over and she's nudging you in the ribs because you're beginning to snore. Or maybe you had this mandatory training class, at work, and you just couldn't keep your eyes open during this. The guy's giving the presentation. Or maybe it's more recent time. Maybe it's just like right now, Yeah, there you go. Wake him up. The disciples are awakened to a crowd of people who they've come to arrest Jesus, and they're so overwhelmed by the scene that things just kind of get rough. I mean, you consider the torches and soldiers and the weapons that are surrounding them. You can imagine as they're lying there kind of lounged out, and they have to look around, and there's all these people around them, and they're wondering what's going on. And it appears that they'd had opportunity, so they decided they're just going to run and be done with it for the most part. And we find out verse 55 of chapter 26 of Matthew, it says, "At this time Jesus said to the crowd, 'Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me?' He said, 'Every day I sat with you in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophet may be fulfilled.' Then all the disciples deserted him and fled." Now these guys had been close to Jesus. I mean, inwardly they enjoyed positions of popularity, and some of them had even longed for positions of power. They had even asked Jesus about that and the prestige that come along about being a follower of Jesus. They even asked Jesus when his kingdom come, could they sit at his right hand and his left hand in his kingdom? I mean, they understand what it's like to be and who Jesus really is. And so when it appeared that the future meant blood and bleeding for Jesus, instead of leading with Jesus, their commitment changed. It faltered. I mean, and let's be honest, there are times in our life where our commitment to Jesus falters as well. And I think it's the reason Jesus could say to his sleeping disciples, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is just so weak." I wonder if that sounds familiar. I mean, our attentions are good. But we're often just too tired to follow through with some of the things that we commit to. Instead of spending 30 minutes in prayer, we end up watching 30 minutes worth of TV and falling asleep in our recliners. Or we intend to wake up early and spend some time reading the Bible, but we hit the snooze button a few times, and by the time we realize how many times we've hit it, it's now jump up, rush, get a shower, throw on some clothes, and make it to the office 5 minutes late. Or we know the kind of parents God wants us to be, and at the end of a long, hard work day, instead of maybe spending time with our kids and praying with them and finding out what life is really being up to for that day, we've just put them to sleep and plop down in front of a TV or to surf the internet, and that's just it. So maybe for you, it's not so much fatigue, maybe it's just fear. I mean, like the disciples, perhaps you just deserted Jesus in your following of him when you fear that he's going to demand something more from you than you're really wanting to give him. A lot of people do that. I mean, you have just a fear of commitment. I mean, there's just a big fear of commitment in our society today. A lot of people just struggle with trying to commit to something and following through with it because what if I get hurt in the process? And so maybe you want a relationship with Jesus, you just don't want the cost of everything that it will cost you down the line. You don't want it to cost you anything. After all, he's Jesus. He doesn't need anything I've got. Why should he ask me? And then, so we see the disciple story as one of fatigue and fear. Is it yours? Then there's Simon Peter's story. He's a very common fellow we can encounter in Scripture as we read in Matthew chapter 26. Peter is probably the lead spokesman for the disciples. We could probably say, essentially, he's the unofficial lead disciple. People look to him. Later on, after Jesus' crucifixion, ultimately, he comes out of the grave and ascends into heaven. He's considered one of the elders of the church in Jerusalem. And so people would look to him for advice as to how to handle situations that rose up in the early church. So we could see where Peter's story is significant. He's named along with James and John as being those closest disciples to Jesus. And so early in Matthew chapter 26, just before Jesus is praying here in the Mount of Olives, Jesus says to his disciples, "You're all going to fall away and desert me tonight." and they can't believe it. Matter of fact, Peter even speaks on their behalf in Matthew chapter 26, verses 33 through 35. He says this, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. Now, do you hear the number of times that Peter uses a certain word? I. It's all about me. I mean, I'm all in. I can be there when nobody else can. I mean, you know, these guys, they might disown you, but it's not going to be me. I'm above all that, basically, is what he's saying. And sometimes we feel the same way. I mean, he truly meant it in the moment. Don't get me wrong. I mean, when Jesus is talking about that, he is so in love with Jesus, and he is so devoted to following Christ that he would do anything if at that moment somebody kicked the door in and said something to them about, "You're going to die with Jesus." He says, "Take me first." We even see it in the garden. He draws a sword and he cuts off Malchus's ear as he approaches him. As one man said, his intention was not to sever his ear from the side of his head. His intention was to split him in two. Mal would have fell one way and cussed the other way. He was happy in knowing that he could have died with Jesus. And in just a moment, things changed. It went from drawing a sword and willing to die and fight for Jesus to then turning and running in pure fear of his own life. Now, I think when he's making this statement to Jesus, if everybody else falls away, that's one thing, but I'll never disown you. I really think he meant it, but that was before the swords and the whips and everything else came out. I mean, at this time when he's making this statement, you know who's there? Just a bunch of people who love Jesus. And how easy it is for us to make those statements when we're around other people who think the same as we do. But it's when you're around people who do not think the same as you do. That's when life's hardest choices are having to be made. So perhaps his story can be found in this word arrogance. You know, he's essentially saying they might, but I won't, for lack of a better way of putting it. And as you've often heard it say never, because you know that's exactly when things are going to turn around on you. I mean, the Bible says that pride comes before the fall. Pride causes us to overestimate ourselves and underestimate our need to depend on God. I mean, dealing with pride is difficult because there's very few people that acknowledge they got a problem with pride. That's the problem with pride. In other words, Obadiah verse 3 says this, "Your pride, the pride of your heart has deceived you." And we look at it this way, what keeps you from seeing the pride in your life? It's the pride in your life. I'm too proud to recognize that. You ever know somebody that was ever too proud to accept a little help when they needed it? I mean, they're always the first people to show up and want to lend a helping hand, but they're the last person to ask for help when they really need it. That's pride. You know, that's what he's getting at. And so basically what people have to say then when they see problems is, I don't have any problems. Now don't get me wrong, they have no problem recognizing problems in other people's lives. They just don't recognize them in their own. And so when challenge comes, the source of our confidence is exposed. And now we just have to skip ahead in this chapter about Simon Peter's story as it's unfolding after the arrest of Christ. And we see in verses 69 through 75 of chapter 26, Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and the servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. He says, "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway where another girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath. "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you're one of them, for your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I do not know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the words of Jesus that he had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Now, Luke 22, verse 61 would say, it tells us a little bit more about this story. We won't go there and turn there, but it says that when he denied Jesus for the third time, that the Lord turned and looked straight at him. So now obviously Peter's in close enough proximity. I mean, he's trying to be true to his word, to be a follower of Jesus even to the end. But yet people are challenging him, and he sees what's taken place with Jesus. He's already seen where he's been led away and been beaten and hit in the face, and he doesn't want to have to maybe deal with that himself. And so now, evidently, Jesus is being led from Caiaphas' house, and it was in God's timing that when he says that Jesus turns and he looks straight at him. Now, I don't think it's just haughty look like, oh, I told you so. I think it was a look of just a close friend being betrayed by a close friend. I think that's what the look that Jesus, it was a look of disappointment. And maybe you felt that in your life. And finally, this morning, as we consider stories of people who have deserted Jesus, we have to ultimately come and leads us to Judas' story. I mean, we love to beat Judas up pretty bad, don't we? We love to think about how bad he was because he sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. And I think a fairly good case could be made that until the betrayal, Judas was actually one of Jesus' closest friends. Now, you might not understand that. You might even say, well, one of you was chosen to betray me. So obviously Jesus chose him. He would never get close to him because he knew that he was going to be the one to betray him to begin with. But you have to consider the culture. I mean, he's been put in charge of the money bag, and typically you only put those who you feel are the most trusted in charge of the money. You look at the seating arrangements that were typical of Jewish festivals and in the culture at that time, and you consider the things that took place after you look at the conversations that they had at the Last Supper, and it appears that John is on Jesus' right hand, and yet Judas is right there next to him on his left. And the person who typically sat there was the place of an honored guest, an invited guest, a person who was very well respected. Now maybe the right-hand person was that person who had been looked to be the most significant as far as in a position of prominence. But this was a very important guest, is the way Jesus had seated them. And so we realize that maybe he was even a close, intimate friend. The Old Testament prophecy tells us in Psalm 41, verse 9, it's written thousands of years before Christ's birth, but it shares this with us in Psalm 41, verse 9. It says, even my close friend whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted his heel against me. You see, Jesus, for the all other way of putting it, trusted Judas. Now, if you were on Family Feud and maybe the survey goes like this, 100 people surveyed. Name someone who was betrayed by a friend. I bet, or someone who betrayed a friend. Judas's name would come up, wouldn't it? My daughter's sitting here today, Kelsey, and she's carrying our first grandchild. It's a little girl. Her name's Stella Claire. Now, you know, up before we found out she was a little girl, they were picking out names, both girls' and boys' names, because they were trying to prepare for which they were. Now, in all the list of boys' names, I never heard her say, you know, I think we're going to just want to name him Judas. All the folks that are on the membership roll here at New Testament Christian Church, I've looked through the ledgers over, you know, since in my time here, and over the 400 names that are there, there's not the first Judas on the list of members of the church. Now, there's Peters and Jameses and Johns, and, you know, there's Daniels and Chris's, and you can name it, but no Judases. I mean, it's just not a name that we would come up with. And of the 12 disciples, Judas is the only outsider, if you consider that. All the others were from Galilee. Judas was the only person who was not from the area of Galilee. And so he's often mischaracterized, I think. When Jesus said to the disciples, one of you will betray me, you know, the other 11 didn't just look around and say, well, it's got to be him. I mean, look at those eyebrows. He looks nothing like, he talks different from the rest of us. It's going to be him. As a matter of fact, when Jesus says, one of you will betray me, they all begin to discuss amongst themselves whom Jesus was talking about. So obviously there was nothing significant that stood out about Judas that would make everyone think that he would be a one that would betray him. In fact, if you think about it, and usually the most trusted individual person, that's the one people least likely are to consider. So most likely he would not be a person they would have thought about. Now, a couple of words we consider about Judas maybe as we think about his story is one of greed and disillusionment. I mean, you think about Judas. I mean, he's had some unspoken expectations of some sort about Jesus being the king. I mean, he knows that Jesus he's royal. He knows Jesus is the king, but what he's got Jesus in mind for Jesus is that he will overthrow the Roman government. And then he will really have a position of prominence as he oversees the treasury for the state, so to speak. But that's not what Jesus has in mind at all. And so maybe he was disillusioned about that, because he knew that the power that Jesus had come to establish wasn't something that everyone would be able to see right here and right now. And over the years, I think I have to tell you, I've seen a number of Christians desert God because they didn't think God was doing His job. You know? I mean, they have unwritten expectations. We all do, don't we? I mean, you think about it. If I'm a Christian, then I won't have any money problems. How many of you could ever raise your hand and say, I've never had a first financial difficulty in my life as long as I've been a Christian? Or maybe you say, if I'm a Christian, I won't have any health problems. I mean, we read off a long list of names today, and almost every one of them had to deal with health problems. And most of those people's names are people who follow Jesus. Or if I'm a Christian, I'll never have to bury a child or a spouse. Or you see how we have this disillusioned thought that if I just follow God, if I just surrender to Jesus, everything will be perfect. And we've got certain expectations that we just are not comfortable with living without. So we expect God to provide for us this comfortable lifestyle. And Jesus never promised those things. As a matter of fact, He says, because I suffer, you're going to suffer. That's just the way it is. And so if you see Jesus as a wise counselor who will solve all your problems and bring family harmony immediately, you're going to be disillusioned. That's just the way it works out. I mean, you look at Jesus dying on the cross when He's there. Who's there? His mother and none of His siblings. Jesus had brothers, even had sisters. But none of them were there but His mother. And of all His disciples, who's there? John. He's the only one that stood up with Him. Now, we read about His mother. We read nothing else about Jesus after He's 12 years old about His father. We don't know what happened. Did His dad die? We just have to speculate that maybe something happened to Joseph and he died in the course of Jesus' life as he grew up into manhood, and we just hear nothing else about him. History records very little of him after Jesus' time there in the temple. So we just realize that that's just the way things are. And if everything's not going to go perfect for God on foot, as Mark Lowry would put him, you think everything's going to go perfect for you and I. You see, if you see Jesus as a great physician who's going to heal all your diseases, you're going to be disillusioned. I mean, you look at the cross, Jesus is suffering there as no man has ever suffered before. And He dies a death at age 33 of nothing that no one would want to have to deal with. Sometimes I hear athletes giving credit to God for something that took place. I just thank God that like the basketball games are on now. Somebody makes this shot here, there, and I was praying as soon as I let it go that it was going to go in. I just prayed God was going to let it. I'm just so thankful He let that shot go in. The only problem I have with that is there's probably somebody on the other side praying it wouldn't go in. And so the person who prayed that it goes in and it does go in, they're like, God heard me. He loves me. Everything goes my way because I pray for it. The person who's on the other side praying, please don't let it go in, God doesn't love me. God let me down. He doesn't care about my plight in life. He doesn't care about my desires in life. You see the problem we had with that? Now, has one of these factors from the disciple story impacted you in some way in your life? I mean, does it impact you in the way you respond to Jesus? I mean, consider, we all deal with fatigue and fear, arrogance and greed and disillusionment, but they're all parts of our story in some way or another. ultimately for the disciples and for us, it comes down to a choice we have to make. I mean, we choose Jesus over comfort and security. We will need to choose Jesus over our relationships. We will need to choose Jesus over our money. I mean, when the heat's on, when testing comes in life, what do we do? Who do we choose? How will you answer life's most important question for yourself? In other words, how will you respond to Jesus? Jesus is not looking to banish you, beat you down, or cause a problem in your life where everything just seems to never go your way. I shared the other day with Brother Al how when Amy and I were getting ready to go to Bible college to study for ministry, when we got to where we were going, Amy will correct me if I'm wrong, but she's good at that. I think we had $30, right, in our checking account. We'd basically spent everything we had, retirement funds, everything else, so we could go to school. We had gotten moved, we'd gotten settled, the rent was paid for the first month or so. Everything was lined up, and there we were after we got there, and we're both thinking we've got enough gas money to get back to Jacksonville. You see, now here we are trying to study for ministry, and here God has basically broken us. And I'm thinking, I said, well, you know, if I'm trying to study for ministry, then why couldn't I have kept my retirement? I mean, I couldn't go to Bible college without either paying for it or qualifying for some type of financial aid because I have retirement in a fund somewhere. I can't go to Bible college and get any financial aid because you've got money. But if I take money out, then I got to pay the penalty for taking the money out. And then I've got to use my retirement and put it toward bills or whatever, or school expenses. Now I'm broke. And what God was saying, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to trust me, you have to give it all over to me. Let me break you down. Let me get you where you're completely dependent upon me, because then I know you will follow me. And maybe for some of us today, we're still wrestling with this thing about giving it all to Jesus. I mean, no matter what's going on in my life, I'm suffering, and I just want to get out from underneath whatever it is I'm dealing with. And sometimes God uses those to make us be completely dependent on Him. And so when the heat is on, when testing comes, how will you answer the question? Not long ago, I read a story about an elderly missionary who was returning from the mission field after spending 30 years. His wife has passed away as he was overseas. He come back to retire from being a full-time missionary, and he was moving to the Midwest. He was going to live with his daughter and their husband. So he flies from overseas, and he comes in, he lands in California. He gets on a bus from California, and he's heading to the Midwest. And the first night, they stop in Las Vegas, and they have to stop for a layover or whatever the case is. And he gets a room there. And when he's there, it's midnight, and he's got in his room in a nice hotel. And he looks out, and naturally the strip's lit up, and it's like daytime. And he goes to a show. He sees different things. He even goes to a car show. Saw the best cars the world had to offer. I mean, there's nothing. The headline artists, whoever was famous at the time were there. I mean, there was nothing at your wheel that you could have that wasn't at your fingertips, that you could get if you wanted to. So he found himself walking around and just looking at what was available in this world. And he goes back to his room. He doesn't turn on the light. He opens the window, and he looks down, and he sees all these lights of all these things that are advertising everything that's the greatest in all the world that you just can't live without. That's the reason you're here. And he gets on his knees, and he looks up to heaven, and he says this little prayer. God, I'm thankful that there's nothing here that I want more than you. And for many of us, we would say, boy, that's just the epitome of everything I've been looking to achieve in life, if I can just have all that. And maybe God's just saying, look in a different direction. Because ultimately what you really need is me. In just a moment, we're going to be singing, I'd Rather Have Jesus, as our invitation. What is it in your life that have you placed above Christ? Have you deserted Him and turned your back on Him as a disciple of Jesus for something else? And if there's anything that you say you'd rather have than Jesus at this time, then this invitation is for you.